It was at that moment that all of the heavy armored units and even the tank-like vehicles began to fire on Delius, the shots beginning to rain down one after another, impacting him. They were far heavier than the weapons being fired by the ground units. Even the airship floating overhead began to open up, releasing missiles, flying in Delius's direction, cannon fire, and basically everything. The entire heavy unit battalion and airship was firing on him simultaneously as explosions rang out from Delius's location one after another. From inside of the flurry of explosions that riddled the area that he was standing in, Delius didn't move a muscle. The firing continued for some time before, as there was no movement, they decided to stop. A large amount of smoke and dust filling the area and making it impossible to see anything. So, they waited, and as the breeze began to pick up through the area, the smoke and dust beginning to clear, there amidst the fallout and destruction stood Delius, simply standing there with his eyes covered for a moment, a single arm raised to shield them from the brightness and smoke of the explosion that filled the area around him. But as everything began to calm down, he lowered his arm. Not a scratch on his entire body. His clothes, which had been given to him, and he had only recently learned how to put on without tearing apart, were now burnt to ashes, left in tatters, some of it still on fire. However, none of it fazed Delius. There wasn't a single scrape, scuff, scratch, burn mark, or injury of any kind to show for the waylay of destruction that they rained down on him. As they saw him, they began to raise their weapons, preparing for another onslaught of fire, as suddenly Delius lunged through the air forward, kneeling down only slightly for just a moment, before suddenly bursting forward, flying like a bullet through the air, spinning around and hitting one of the ground walker units that looked somewhat like egg shapes, with arms hanging off of them and legs holding them up. Somehow, during his propulsion, Delius had spun around, so that the moment that he impacted, it was his feet, pressed tight together, that slammed into the armored unit. The metal it was forged of, hardened to withstand intense combat and firepower, crumpled under the impact, sending the armored walker unit flying in the opposite direction, several hundred feet, smashing through a concrete structure before clattering to the ground. As Delius hit the ground, he immediately began moving to the left, towards an armored vehicle, tank-like in its construction, the cannon-like nozzle on top, beginning to spin towards Delius's location, but nowhere near fast enough. As in but a moment, Delius was already right next to it, pulling the sword from its sheath, and with a single upward swing, it was like the entire world underneath that tank went sailing. The tank itself was shattered, slashed into two parts that went flying into the air, each one sending off small bits of metal from armored treads and mechanical parts that formed the vehicle. And before the dust could even clear, once again like a bullet, Delius shot through it, the air from his speed of movement forcing a hole in the cloud of smoke and dust that was left in the wake of his last attack, as he flew into the side of the other tank unit, impacting it so hard that it came halfway off of its base structure. One half of the treads lifting off of the ground as the steel and metal it was forged of warped under the impact, and the entire tank began to roll over. As it did, Delius dropping to the other side of it, digging a single hand into the hardened steel surface of this tank-like vehicle, lifting it completely off of the ground. With just a flick of his wrist, the tank lifted off of the placement on the top of his hand, and with the opposite hand still wielding the blade, he slashed at the tank twice, severing it into multiple pieces that very quickly exploded around him. The crushing sound of two other walker units approaching from nearby began to fill the area as their multiple-ton structures lumbered their way over slowly, crushing the concrete surfaces that they standed on. Delius once again began rushing out of the smoke of the explosion towards one of the armored units approaching, this time at a bit slower of a pace, enough so that the armored unit actually tried to draw a bead on him, firing at him, but unable to hit the target, before Delius was on him with a single upward slash of his blade, separating the left arm wielding the gun from the rest of the mech armored unit that he was piloting. Before it could do anything else, another single slash took both of its legs off from under it, sending the egg-like unit crumbling to the ground, face forward, sort of wriggling around, unable to really do anything, as Delius once again felt another heavy impact, only making him jerk to the side a bit, seeing that the other unit had drawn a bead on him. However, seeing that the firearm wasn't working, he quickly disposed of it, the armored unit pulling from its back a large blade that seemed to extend outward, snapping itself into place in several segments as an outer rim of the blade seemed to alight with a bright fluorescent light as the armored unit picked up speed at what amounted to a run for its gargantuan size, holding the massive blade over its head as it came in for a massive downward strike. Delius simply raised his left arm, the impact of the blade clattering down on him, pressing his feet into the concrete and dirt below him, smashing them into a crater. However, Delius himself remained unflinching as the giant mechanical structure tried to press the blade down, Delius's feet digging deeper and deeper into the earth beneath him, before Delius gave off a somewhat disgruntled expression in the mech's direction, and with his bare arm simply flexing back and giving it a solid upward swing, shattering the blade with his bare arm. As suddenly Delius rushed forward, jumping just a bit to impact the front of this hardened metal armor suit, digging his hands through the steel like it were Play-Doh, ripping it apart to find the squishy center. As he ripped this metal apart, he quickly found a person inside. With a single grasp, all that was necessary was a pull to remove him from the suit and send the suit itself clattering to the ground, as Delius threw the figure within the suit down as well. It was at that point that the airship overhead decided to make a run for it, the engines of the ship kicking up as wind spilled out, being moved in all directions as the ship began to fly over the facility that it was attacking, trying to make an escape. Seeing the ship attempting to leave, Delius took a short look around him. Seeing the armored unit destroyed before him, Delius simply walked up to its egg-like structure, grasped it firmly and lifted it over his head while sheathing his sword. And then, with it firmly in his grasp, turned to face the now fleeing airship. Delius cocked his head a bit one direction, and then back the other, taking a firm look at the ship as it began to get further into the distance. Then he spread his legs, crouching a bit, still holding this mech unit over his head tightly, as he took aim at the target in the distance. After only a second or two, feeling as if he had locked in on his target, and then, as if throwing a massive shot put, Delius launched the armored unit out into the air, throwing it with such force that an immense explosion of wind erupted from around him, a shockwave of air that sent flying out in all directions as the armor unit flew like a bullet far into the distance. The ship, so far away, beginning to look tiny in comparison to its actual size from how far it had traveled, the armored unit flying towards it, disappearing, becoming almost invisible, before deep into the distance, the horizon where you could still see the ship, but only just. An explosion let out as Delius hit his target in the distance, and a long trail of smoke began to lead down towards the ground. It was at that point that Delius felt a gunshot ring out, bouncing off of him, first one and then another, as he looked to the side to see the individual that he had ripped out of the armored unit, pulling a small sidearm and beginning to fire on him, unloading every round in the clip, furiously screaming as he approached, completely fearlessly, despite the display that Delius had just put on, unloading bullets with no hope of victory, all while screaming this statement: Avorek Moskawo del Ra. Avorek Moskawo del La. He cried out as he fired the gun over and over and over again, stepping closer and closer to Delius, until the gun simply wouldn't fire anymore, until finally the individual simply threw down the gun. Then, placing his hands on the helmet that he was wearing, he clicked in a few buttons, rapidly removing it and throwing it to the side. His somewhat strange and alien appearance to Delius, equally matched by a simple furious shout in Delius's direction, as if he were simply screaming out his rage, spreading his arms wide, as if he were simply ready to accept whatever Delius doled out. For a moment, Delius just looked at him, before he repeated that statement again. His arms spread wide, furiously screamed it. Everett Moscasta de la, he said again. Delius sighed a bit. You know I don't understand what you're saying, right? But I suppose it doesn't matter. Since you feel like yelling at me in your language, I suppose I can return the favor. You probably don't understand what I'm saying, but I'm gonna say it anyways. On my world, there is something that we call blood drunk, Delius said, as he began to take one after another step towards this individual, who still kept his arms spread wide, but as Delius approached, began to take slow steps back away from him, his form unconsciously shrinking back in fear of Delius's approach. This state, blood drunk, it happens to my people when they lose something. It can happen for many reasons. or a single reason, depending on how you look at it. But usually, it is all simply a response to something that has been lost. A member of my village might lose a child or a family member to one of the beasts that haunt the wild outside of our village. And in their rage and hatred, they become blood drunk. This is what we call it, on my world, this state, blood drunk. It is seen as a sickness of the soul, a state in which one is consumed by rage and the desire to kill. And this rage and the desire to kill overwhelms their better self, their knowledge and wisdom, their sense of right and wrong, and they begin to act against the flow of the natural cycle. They desire the death of the beast that took the one from their family, or their friend, or their child. Sometimes even so much that killing the beast in and of itself is not enough. They become drunk on the rage, and so seek out every beast of its likeness, and attempt to slay them without mercy, without reason or cause. No reason other than their hatred, their drunken rage on blood. This stands against the natural flow. The taking of life is meant to have purpose. When one takes the life of another, regardless of what form that life takes, that is meant to be a purposeful act to preserve one's own life, or the life of one's family or friends, to feed you when you are hungry, to clothe you when you are cold, to protect you from death's grasp. But those who are infected with this sickness of the soul, who become blood drunk, cannot be reached by reason. They lose themselves, and in so doing, lose sight of the cycle of things. You, my friend, have become blood drunk, and for that reason, I am sorry, and I forgive you, Delia said, a somewhat compassionate look on his face. I know that there are many causes that can bring about this madness, and I am sorry for whatever they are. Truly, in my heart, I wish only to rid you of this madness, but simply because I empathize does not mean I will allow your madness to continue, Delia said, as the steps he continued to take towards the individual finally had them collapsed on the ground backwards, shuffling away, a look of fear in their eyes as Delia stood over them. I say it only one more time. I am sorry, Delia said, as he raised his fist and with a single stroke punched the individual into the chest, crushing him into a crater in the ground, from which he was no longer moving. As Delius removed his fist and began to take a look around at the destruction that they had wrought, and that he came to put an end to, the battle was finally over. Delius had claimed victory, his first on this new world. But was this to be a repeating cycle? Delius thought to himself. How many of them are there that have lost themselves to this madness, this blood drunk, he said, as he peered about the destruction, the fire and smoke rising from what was once beautiful scenery, lamenting the broken nature of the conflict itself.